Hey everybody, my name's Chris.
I'm Jen.
And this is World Wakers.
So today we're going to kind of talk about ourselves a little bit. And because last week we kind of teased that we were going to have kind of a new segment, if you will, focusing more so on our own creative process and our own creations, I guess you could say, which is what the whole concept of Forge is.
Yep.
So today, specifically, we're going to be comparing and contrasting mine and my brother's different world building processes, because we literally start from the opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Like, completely opposite ends.
Yeah.
Because I am typically character and scenario first.
And I am world and, like, nations first.
Yeah, entire nations, which blows my mind. I don't know how you do that.
I don't know. I start big, go small.
Yeah, I start small, go big.
But I'll be starting us out with my creative process, which I start off with. Essentially, what I do is I think about the world itself and essentially what type of world I'm wanting to make. Getting a little more detailed into it is essentially I am finding out, is this fantasy? Is this sci-fi? Is it a fantasy sci-fi mix? Is it steampunk? Is it any other one? Is it non-fictional, non-magical, blah, 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 and all that stuff?
Non-fictional?
Well, when I say non-fictional, I mean like medieval.
Oh, like more historical, like historical fantasy rather than...
Yeah, historical, either historical itself or historical fantasy or just that kind of thing. But I essentially start from there, and once I have a general idea of what type of world I'm going to be making, the next thing I do is I go one step down. Can I actually have that? It'll help me make sure my thoughts...
What, do you need to look at notes?
Yes, I do.
Well, so do I, so there you go.
Okay. Once I actually have a good idea of what type of world, then I start to actually find out what type of people are in this world. The big thing is are they there willingly? Are they there just because of circumstance? Are they there just because, like, their people have been there, it's still inhospitable to them, but they've just been there for so long that they're not going to leave? Did they come there? Did they grow up there? It's a lot of the big processes to actually understand. It's like, why are these people here? Why would they stay here? Why would they continue to be here? Which then also ties into my next step, which is the type of interactions in the world. Is there large countries? Are there only clans? Do they have large alliances in between them? Are there large rivalries and that kind of thing? And at that point, then you start to go even deeper into it, and you start, all right, what's the reason for these people to interact with each other? What's the reason for the rivalry between these two nations? Is it over resources? Is it over land? Is it just because of history? It's kind of a generalization after generalization, and then keeping it almost within a scope and almost within a trope, so that the bigger, wider world can actually be filled in as I'm slowly getting more and more detailed the farther I go into it. Mm-hmm. That's one thing, is a reason for the interactions specifically. And then right after that, then you get, once you actually figure out the type of interactions that happen and then the reasons for interactions, then you start to figure out the economic of the world. You start to figure out the history of the world, the ecosystem, etc., where essentially you start to understand exactly why these people are here, what they're doing, what they need, what these other people need. Like, these group, like, actually, a project that we are actually working on together is there's a very specific interaction between two larger nations over a specific resource, because that resource is prevalent. It's needed for both sides for different reasons. And because of that interaction, then we have history, we have conflict, we have resolution, we have negotiation, politics, all this. And even though those two groups are very different, even by a fundamental standard, they interact. They constantly are talking to each other, because of what we set up as a basis about why they have to interact with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
And then at that point, that's when you actually start to get to the personal. For me, that's when I start to get to the personal stuff. I start to put names to what people are doing. I make large figures, people who did big things, people who do small things, and essentially, like, going from that point, it's like, all right, so here's a shopkeeper. How would he? And at that point, I already know how he would interact with those people because I already have the full basis of the world and what they're doing, and so he will do a certain thing automatically, and I'm already set to know what he's going to do. And as the main character goes and progresses through the story, this is just at this point, then it becomes that the main character makes their story, but the world doesn't bend to the main character. The world just interacts with the main character.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, for my creative process especially, I go big so I can figure out the small details, and it's, I guess in the long run, it feels like a lot of work, but for me, it doesn't feel like a lot of work because at the same time, if I need to, I can even start partway through the process where instead of starting with the entire world, I start with a faction. I'm like, that faction would be actually kind of interesting in this setting. Like, let's say a steampunk faction in a heavy fantasy world where it's like they're very industrial, they're very this, they're very, very big on electronics, whereas everybody else, they're still in like the Bronze era. And so
bronze, wow.
Yeah, bronze, or maybe just getting to the steel era where they're still heavily reliant on sword and shield instead of actually. And then we have these guys coming in. They're a small faction, but they end up becoming a very powerful faction because they're technologically advanced compared to them.
Right. Yeah.
So that's just the general idea. I was like, okay, well, that's an interesting way of putting that. And then you take a twist, and then boom, you have either an antagonist, a neutral party, or the protagonist group, depending on how you want to run the story.
That's actually very interesting because I know, for me, it's difficult to start off in a broad scope, unless it's like specifically like some sort of scenario, because my starting point is typically either a type of character that I want, or maybe a type of scenario that I want to kind of play around in. I love asking what-if questions, especially if I have a character that's already established and I have a personality, a name, or something like that, even if it's bare bones personality, and then I can go like, okay, so what if this happens? And so from the starting point, the personal starting point, because the scenario, it's not global, it's not, I guess in some cases, possibly it could be, it's a scenario that pairs with the character. And then once I kind of have that put together, then I can kind of start shaping the character to sometimes how I need them to be, sometimes how I want them to be. But they always end up growing into kind of their own person the more I write them, because, to me, it's more of a, I guess you could say, a living thing, as best as you can, which is kind of what you want with fiction anyway. You want to be able to understand and kind of see the character and who they are, and even if you don't fully understand their motivations, you kind of understand them basically on a human level, in a sense. You don't want to, because not every villain needs to be relatable.
DreamWorks actually does that very well, because in their newest movie, Last Wish, with Puss in Boots, they had the villain Jack Horner, which he was completely unrelatable. He had everything. He had everything he possibly needed, but he was still evil. He still wanted more. He was still greedy. He was still just it's almost like he had no empathy whatsoever. He could not care less about anybody else. So much so that he flippantly shot people, flippantly used people as cannon fodder. And he was like, oh, well, I kind of wish they at least died a little bit less fast. and that's the thing, though, is you have a character whose entire thing is he's evil.
Yeah. Well, and see, that's the thing, is a character doesn't necessarily have to be relatable to be good.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to see yourself in everything in order to connect or enjoy it. That's just that. And honestly, anybody who thinks that they have to see themselves in something in order to relate, lives a very shallow existence. But I digress. So starting with character and scenario, and then kind of not because I don't want to I don't shoehorn, because things can change. Writing is always fluid, but you also there's a balance between letting it go as it goes and then helping to kind of steer where it goes. Because you don't want it going too far off left field. But once I have I have a better understanding of the character and scenario, or either or, then I can start expanding on the personality. And the personality and the setting sometimes helps me work on their backstory. And once I start tapping into their backstory, that's when I can start looking at the rest of the world at large. But I still start with their world. Mm-hmm. What is their life inside of this possible broader setting? Which I do think about the broader setting, because, you have to know, is this a sci-fi? Is this a fantasy? Is this a medieval fantasy? Is it urban fantasy? Mm-hmm. Especially if you have other races or other creatures involved, you have to you can't just, look at one thing and ignore all the rest, because then you have a world that doesn't feel like it's lived in.
Essentially, it's almost like a mocap that your main character is like 2D side-scrolling through.
Yeah, but see, even 2D side-scrollers, the world can be filled in very well.
They've been actually very... there's a lot of games out there that have been doing a very good job of that recently.
And so, but how the world starts expanding is I start kind of thinking about, who the character interacts with, if there's any family members. I love starting with family members because I personally love creating family trees. I use a particular website that you're supposed to hook up with, like Ancestry.com or something like that. But I have about 15 separate family trees on that one account that I've just been... I mean, some of them are huge, some of them are itty-bitty because it's a nice place to store information. Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, I love creating family trees. I don't get it. I don't always fill in the names, but it's like I always have at least 2 or 3, sometimes 4 generations worth of people, depending on how in-depth my story is and what I necessarily think I need at the time. But I can always expand on it later, and sometimes I do. But so by expanding the other characters around the main character, or that out of necessity expands the world. And then once I get a good grasp of that, then I can start looking at the world at large. But even then, I still don't necessarily fill all of it in. Well, I mean, because I kind of I fill it in as I go. But that's where the editing process is so important, because you can go back and fill in information that you didn't know ahead of time. But it's kind of like it's like discovering. It's discovering as you go.
Yeah.
But then you have to make sure that it all remains a cohesive unit by the time you're finished with it.
That is very true, because even from my point mine is it's almost like a broad discovery, where yours is almost like an archaeological dig, where you're going down there, you're getting the fine details and all this. Mine is more of like almost an explorer going over a new landscape. I'm on the scenic route. I'm going around. I'm finding this. I'm like, that's cool. That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, that's true.
And then you're over there, like, I'm getting all the details, every single detail. And I'm like, it's interesting because when we look at it from both points of view, the other one seems inefficient to the other. Because for me, on my end, I'm like, I need to know everything. I need to know, because sometimes the story goes directions that I didn't expect it. And so I'm like, because as I mentioned this before in the past, but I've actually been a GM multiple times, and I have learned that the hardest thing is to keep your bag of cats going in the right direction. Because by golly, they want to do the exact opposite of what you originally planned. And so, in that way, it actually helped with me. It helps that I already thought that way, because then essentially what I did is I threw them in a location. I had a broad spectrum of general ideas of what they could do, and when they finally chose to go that direction, then I started filling in the path.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. To me, that makes a lot of sense, specifically for tabletop.
Yep.
Unless you're really, really good at manipulating your players and railroading them into where you want to go. But even because unfortunately, I haven't played tabletop before, even though I really want to. Well, I have a little bit. I have helped play test your tabletop game that you're working on.
That is very true. Yeah, actually, no, yeah. That is, sadly, your only experience with it. But
yeah. Well, it's not sad, but...
That's true. Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't mind playing a D&D campaign or some other one or something like that. It's just finding the group. For some reason, now that it's online, it's even harder. But anyway.
Well, I mean, we've had a group that... we've been playing together for almost 10 years, but we've had a couple people here and there leave because of reasons, getting married, this...
Yeah, it happens.
Scheduling conflicts or something. I mean, we've actually held together fairly well for this entire time, and apparently that is like a unicorn with 2 horns level of rare.
Yeah, apparently.
Because I that's one thing I love to read, or love to watch some YouTube videos about D&D stories, and one of the most prevalent ones is the game masters that have a hard time actually like getting their players to even stick to a schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Which, amazingly for us, we have a weekly meeting, and we all don't live in the same states either, but somehow we do it.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time.
Kind of getting back on track with the actual world building part is... That's actually one thing that has helped us, and the reason why we're actually working together on multiple projects is that she helps me figure out the smaller details, the tiny things that happen. And
I don't know how many times you've been telling me your broad scope story, which I think is very fascinating, but I'll ask you like one question, and you just like... It's like you 404 because you have no idea because you've never thought of that. And I'm like, how could you have not thought of that? That's so important. But it's just the different perspectives.
Yes.
That's all.
It's where we come from different areas, because at the same time is she will come to me with a character and I will be like, all right, cool. So how does she deal with this? And how does she deal with those people? And how does she never with that people? Does she know about this? And you're just like, you're sitting there just like staring at me like, yes.
Yeah, it's like, good question. I will get back to you on that one. And it's not like I'm upset or anything. It's just completely different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And what's funny is when we kind of realized that we approach things so differently, I was like, okay, this is either going to be a creative match made in heaven or hell.
Yep.
Because we literally approach it from the complete opposite ends of world building spectrum, at least in my opinion, because you have the wide view beginning and then you have the narrow view beginning. So theoretically, coming together, we should cover all of our bases.
We should meet in the middle.
Somewhere.
Sometimes we meet in the middle, and I'm a little too wide, and she's a little too narrow.
Yeah.
But I mean, that actually doesn't hurt, because then all we have to do is just extend out a little bit and then fill in more.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a really good point, because especially for the projects that we're going to be doing, and particularly the ones that require it, is because both of us love brainstorming sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So the part of the process, and probably what we need to do more, is separating, coming up with our own list of questions,
and then
coming back together again and brainstorming them all out, because we're going to have 2 completely different perspectives, but it's going to cover almost every angle that we can think of, and we can start creating, especially for, I guess I would say, our bigger project. No, it would help us create the World Bible, in a sense.
Yeah.
Because, to me, canon and continuity is very important. It is. It's very important.
That's extremely important, because that's where a lot of people nowadays miss it, is they make a story, and they try to make the canon as they go along. And that's actually one thing that frustrates me a lot, is that if you're going along, you're changing the canon, at that point, that can actually be a trope, where the canon changes as the story goes along because of either convoluted or continuity reasons, but that's something that should happen because it's purposeful. Like there's a lot of games, there's a lot of movies that actually try to do that trope. They don't do the best job with it, but they still try to do it where it's like continuity changes because you finally figured out something that was missing that you were never meant to see until they were shown.
Yeah.
But a lot of things do that where they miss continuity anyway, and then they just don't even care about continuity.
I will give you a good example of that. I know we haven't finished the first season yet, but Rings of Power...
No.
I don't know how many interviews I heard the two showrunners. People were asking them questions and making observations, and their answer was, wow, I didn't even see that. That's not what you want to hear with your creative forerunners.
Yeah,
because that means that everything they did was accidental and nothing is intentional. And they have no story. They're just writing a bunch of characters reacting to scenes. And that's all they have.
Which, that's actually one thing that I've only gotten, 3 episodes in?
No, we've only watched 2 episodes. I've watched the whole first season, unfortunately. I'm making him watch it, so I'm rewatching it and reliving the horrors in preparation for season 2 whenever it drops, because that's another bag of worms and crickets and spiders and other gross things about the writer's strike and the... Anyway, we are getting so far off of Forge, but anyway, but that for the sake of world building, and the sad thing is they had a world that was already pre-built. And they screwed it up anyway.
It's like they went over there to a Jenga pile and just kicked it.
Yeah.
And they said, I made it better.
And then they told people to their faces that every time they wanted to make a decision on what to do, they said, oh, we go back to the books. We go back to the books. We go back to the books. And I'm like, at what point? At what point did you ever look at a book?
I don't even think they can read.
Anyway.
That is a legitimate concern of mine, because if they say they went back to the books, they went to picture books, and they were not Lord of the Rings picture books. I don't know what picture books.
No, it was insert generic fantasy story here picture books.
That's not even a generic fantasy story. But
anyway,
that's an entirely
that is an entirely different video, an entirely different ramble. But to me, it's a really good example of... Well, actually, it's a bad example of world building, because like I said, the world is already built. You have the framework to work in. You have pre-created characters, and you somehow screw every single one of them up.
And even the original characters they did make don't make sense.
Don't make bland, boring, or homicidal maniacs.
Just downright uninteresting.
Yeah.
Like, I hate watching that show because it's not even like, if it's something bad, like I like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I like stupid. That movie is stupid. There is barely any point to it. It's nothing but gags and jokes, and it's just dumb. I love it because it knows that. It went into that. It was like...
It owned it.
It owned it. It was like, I'm going to be stupid for stupid's sake, and then I'm going to up the stupid. This one, I don't even know. I actually don't know the point of the show.
You can tell that they were trying, but you could also tell that the writers were never able to come together and actually work on the scripts. Because of COVID, they had to separate and write... From my understanding, they had to separate, and so there was no writer's room. They all wrote separate stories, and they were barely cohesive. And it's just like, where is the world? You cannot do that. You could at least talk online. I mean, my goodness.
You can have
But anyway, okay. No, okay. The Rings of Power is a rabbit hole that Alice would hate to fall down, okay? That aside, going back to world building, cohesiveness is extremely important. Ask yourself questions. Build your world Bible, because it's something, because I guarantee you, I have done this before, you're going to forget somebody's eye color.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you're gonna forget someone's eye color. You're gonna forget their hair color. Especially if it's a long-form story and not just either a short story or a single novel or something short, a one-off or whatever. You're gonna forget details.
Yeah.
So it is vitally important to write it down. And not to mention, it's just fun to sit down and ask the questions.
Yeah, because more times than not, that'll actually help you push things along, too. Because sometimes it's like, well... Maybe the conflict is being resolved too quickly because your character is smarter than you expected it to be. Well, throw in some more things. You've got more stuff to pull in from to be able to actually increase the conflict or change the conflict. If you have to.
That's the thing is, and that's why the editing process is so important. Because sometimes things just don't work out the way you expect them to, and you have to go back to the drawing board and rework things. And there's nothing wrong with that. That the first draft is always the down and dirty copy.
Oh yeah.
You never work off your first draft.
No, that's dangerous.
That's very dangerous.
But if you enjoyed this kind of short little talk we had about a little bit of the creative process, and if you actually want more of it, go ahead and slap a like, give us a little subscribe. Cause
subscribe.
We forgot how to say this all the other times. But
I know, we've totally forgotten. Hey, subscribe, everybody. Yeah.
But if you like more of this stuff, and if you are interested in our actual own personal things, we will be coming back with more and talking about small details here and there, and then getting in more into it, especially once we're closer to having our books completely finished.
Yep. So, yes, we definitely want to keep working on those and have a finished product. But we'll start teasing that we have stuff. We have things.
And something else to look forward to is in the future, look out for those solo missions. Solo
missions.
So that it will be a very short content or long content, depending on it, where it'll be either I or Jennifer talking about our own stuff solo.
Yeah. Or, I don't know, just whatever we want to talk about.
Yeah. Maybe we just want to rant about something. The other one doesn't care.
Yeah, well, that is possible. Our interests do not always collide.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you guys for listening in. Hit that like button. Smash the subscribe button. And stay awake, everybody.